Time Out with Tim O.
Open up your mind and let me in. Open up your mind and let me in. Open up your mind and let me in.
Hello, welcome to Time Out with Tim O. I'm your host, Tim Owens. As always, very grateful and happy to be here today. I watched a video recently that talked about the effects of American slavery on the Black community. From the video, there's some lasting effects today. It affected the Black people in this country's cultural identity, so on and so forth. But before I play the video, let's talk about slavery for a second. Slavery, a condition in which a human being is owned by another. Started in 1526, ended in 1865. It's about 339 years total. By today's time, about 158 years ago, since slavery. Slave Africans were first brought here in the 1500s. The first slaves arrived in Jamestown around 1619, which was the first English settlement. So after slavery, Jim Crow came about. Jim Crow laws were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. Named after a Black minstrel show character, the laws which existed for about 100 years from the post-Civil War era until 1968, very long time. They were meant to marginalize African Americans by denying the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education, and other opportunities. Those who attempted to defy Jim Crow laws were faced with arrests, fines, jail sentences, violence, and even death. The roots of the Jim Crow laws began as early as 1865, immediately following the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States. Okay, rich history there. So let's go ahead and play the video, and we can talk about things a little further after.
My name is Fountain Hughes. I was born in Charlottesville, Virginia. My grandfather belonged to Thomas Jefferson. My grandfather was 115 years old when he died, and now I am 101 years old.
This is one of the few surviving audio recordings of a formerly enslaved American.
If I thought that I'd ever be a slave again, I'd take a gun and end it all right away. Because you're nothing but a dog. Time cut tobacco, cut all night long out in the field. And if they want you to hang all night long, you hang tobacco. It didn't matter about you being tired, you're afraid to say you're tired. You're not a thing but a dog.
The interviewer called him Uncle Fountain. Shally Marshall called him Pap. He was her great-grandfather, and for much of her early life, they lived under the same roof.
Even after he retired, he walked every day. He got dressed every day, put on a suit with a vest and tie, and he would walk out in the park and he would sit on the bench and, he would greet people.
He'd left Charlottesville in 1881, eventually settling in Baltimore and speaking about the bitter fruit of slavery almost never.
It must have been a tough time for him when he was a kid because he was young when the Civil War ended. People had to go and fend for themselves, and he had to eat rats in order to survive. He did tell me that.
After we got free, then they turned us out like cattle. We didn't have nowhere to go. We didn't know nothing. Wasn't no school. We had no property. We didn't have no home. The dogs have got it now better than we had it when we come along. I didn't have nowhere to go. I didn't have nowhere to sleep. I didn't know what to do. When I think of it today, I don't know how I'm living. But still, I don't like to talk about it because it makes people feel bad.
For many Americans, the idea of slavery seems ancient, something in old books, and so far in the distant past that it has no bearing on our lives today.
I think what is important to understand is that it was something that didn't happen, so long ago that it's completely removed from public memory in the sense that we still carry the legacies of it physically, I think emotionally, spiritually, culturally, communally. It's still there. It's still a part of who we are.
Peyton Young is a scholar and historian who has volunteered at Woodland Cemetery, one of many predominantly Black historic cemeteries in Virginia, places that fell into severe disrepair because of lack of resources and regard, but are being reclaimed and repaired by volunteers. Much of Young's work is in honor of ancestors.
My great-great-great-grandfather, John Jefferson, came to Richmond around 1890 seeking new opportunities. He ultimately died of a stroke in the summer of 1934 at his home on 1400 St. James Street, which is actually right down the road. I found that out when I was living at 507 St. James Street. I was living on the same street.
John Jefferson is buried somewhere at Woodland. Young has been searching for the exact location for years.
All I wanted was to just go to the store, get some flowers, come to his grave and say, hey, we remember you. And I can't do that. And even though I'm, 80 plus years removed, that it's a kind of pain that I can't even really describe because it's something you should have and you don't. To have a kind of sense of completeness is having a connection to your past. I think a lot of people take for granted the easy accessibility they have to their past that oftentimes African American people just do not have.
My mother, Silva, and her mother was bought from the Rutledge family in Charleston.
Given the scarcity of documentation about the individual lives of enslaved Americans, only a few descendants are fortunate enough to have a record of what their forebears endured. Barrington Ross's understanding of slavery is enhanced by the written narrative of his great-grandfather, Jim Henry Jr.
When slavery was over, everyone was happy, but it still was a scar in the memory of Jim Henry. Jim Henry did not forget. How can you just walk away from someone owning you? How can an individual pick up another life immediately following the gruesome toil of slavery on their lives and after a war and just think that everything is just going to be okay?
Trauma expert Simone Jacobs says everything was and is far from okay in the aftermath of slavery.
Slavery was a systematic process of abuse that went on for hundreds of years. We have to understand that in order to keep a group of people subjugated, you have to destroy family connections. You have to destroy attachments. And so what slavery did, how you kept 30 people who were working in your fields from attacking the 10 people up in the big house, was that you made sure that they were constantly living in fear. I think the statistics are like 1 in 3 marriages were broken up, 1 in 5 children were taken away from their parents, but that's just the statistics. We know that it was much worse than that. And we also know that you only have to do that to one family for it to have a devastating effect on everybody else.
Jacobs says that by disrupting attachments among family members, enslavers cause deep destabilization that can continue for generations. After slavery, promises of government support were short-lived or unfulfilled. Despite that, Black people built thriving communities through their own resilience, intelligence, and ingenuity. Often, as in the case of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, racism stepped forward to violently interrupt Black progress, creating more trauma.
Money exchanged hands 12 times before it left the community. But then you get the act of destruction of that community, and that's going to have ripple effects, right? Obviously on the people directly involved in that destruction, but it's going to affect other people in other places so they no longer feel secure too. So those are the ways in which breaking up a person's sense of security can have long-term effects.
Long-term effects that stretch into the present. Carrie Mosley Hobbs, with her family's More Than a Fraction Foundation, is exploring the impact of their family's enslavement at Smithfield Plantation in Blacksburg. In fact, the first step is taking a unique inventory of the fraction descendants to pinpoint traits of the ancestors.
It's hard to talk about the enslaved communities because there's not any documentation. And so we realize as a family that we are the documentation. And so we go about the work that we're doing from that point of view. We'll tell you about ourselves in order to tell you about who they were. And that's the best way to go about it.
The More Than a Fraction Foundation is involved in a scientific study to determine to what degree reconciliation, healing the trauma from slavery and racism, is even possible for America. Mosley Hobbs is active in educating the public. She says that slavery lasted for hundreds of years and ended not long ago.
And that's the reason why we keep talking about race, because it's still a pivotal part of the society, right? Because we're still in the transition out of slavery. So race is still a huge part of it. We're still dismantling a lot of the laws that come from that period. We're still dismantling some of the prejudice. And it's really not that far in the past. So if the American story, including slavery, was a 20-chapter book, we're only on chapter 2. And we got to chapter 2 and we found out that chapter 1 was written wrong, and now we have to go back and clean it up. I'm so sorry, you guys. We're not that far ahead as we think.
Another reminder of the relative proximity of slavery and all its costs starts here. This is Massey's Mill, Virginia, the Nelson County town where Abram Smith was born and lived until a few years after the Civil War. Smith's youngest son, Daniel, passed away in October. But before his death, he wrote about his life in Son of a Slave.
And I remember he grabbed me by the shoulders and he said, "You're the son of A.B. Smith. You come from the ships and you come from the strongest of the strong. And never forget that." And so I never did. Those hands were always there.
He recalls harrowing stories his father would share, including about the capture of 2 runaway slaves.
They found them up a tree, so they hanged them in that tree. And my father had sort of tears in his eyes, like it could have been his brother or,
Brainwashed is the word Smith used to describe the lingering effect of slavery on Americans. He related a story of his mother chastising his older brother for having bought her a house.
She came downstairs and said, "Now you know the house is too good for me. It's better than the houses I clean." Now that's brainwashed. My mother saying that, our whole nation has been brainwashed.
Simone Jacobs says it can be difficult for people who are not Black to understand that each time a racially motivated incident occurs, whether it's a microaggression in an individual's life or a widely publicized attack on someone, it has the potential to re-traumatize. Jacob says that makes it difficult for Black people to develop an internal sense of safety.
And from a therapeutic perspective, when I'm working with a client who's been sexually abused or physically abused, most of the time the abuse is in the past. Or my goal as a therapist is to make sure that they get out of the abusive situation. When we're talking about racial trauma, there is no getting out. The trauma is ongoing. So it is a different kind of trauma.
The sense of safety, aided by connection and belonging, is what begins to occur when people acknowledge the pain of the past and actively look for ways to heal. More universities and historic places are becoming more honest about the slavery that built and sustained their institutions. At Patrick Henry's last plantation, Red Hill in Campbell County, an annual event brings descendants of those who lived, worked, and died there.
We've come from Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, New Jersey, West Virginia. We were all raised in different places.
It's actually a feeling of celebration and of discovery. Because of modern technology with DNA sampling, they're probably going to be able to discover more than just the 47 people that have been known.
We're living in a day and time where the buzzword is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, being included and the information that I received and the invitations meant a lot to me. I've got children, I've got grandchildren, I've got great-grandchildren, and I'm hoping, those doors will also be open for them as well.
Barrington Ross's great-great-grandfather, Jim Henry Sr., was once property of Patrick Henry's family. Ross is among those who've traveled far to learn about their people and to show respect.
Enslaved people's descendants are still around, and then there's still open wounds that need to be healed.
Peyton Young is Red Hill's historical advisor and sees this as the kind of project that will begin to heal trauma through openness and honesty.
I think it's important to talk about our history, the legacy of slavery, because we don't want to silence lives that actually meant something, that contributed to the lives that we're living now, that contributed to our communities, our families, our legacies. They deserve to be talked about just as much as Patrick Henry or any other founding father does.
Okay, welcome back. As you guys can see, pretty informative piece. Now, to talk about today's society, I believe that we have come a long way since slavery, of course, and Jim Crow as well. You look at the number of black millionaires we have in this country, millionaires, pro athletes, and so on and so forth, business owners. I think we've had more opportunities in today's time than we've ever had at any point in time. Do I think there's still work to do? Absolutely. Do I think that racism is as big of a problem as it once was in this country? Absolutely not. I have friends from all over the world, different races, nationalities. We have no issues. We are sometimes, in some cases, closer than blood relatives. Now, as far as some of the things we can improve in the black communities, a lot of the young men are lost. I'm going to keep saying that. A lot of them are lost nowadays. They don't want to be firemen. They don't want to be policemen. They don't want to be anything positive. They want to be entertainers and athletes and, rappers and so on and so forth. But that's something that has to change. But that's going to take the people to step up and to promote some of these positive careers. I think there's a shortage of black male teachers for sure, which is needed in our communities. Resource officers, firemen. There's a lot of careers that we are behind in as far as for young black men especially. So hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope it inspires you to think a little bit about some of these things that you have overlooked over the years, to be able to engage with your children in conversation. I know I definitely have. And as we continue to learn more about our history, we can understand where we're going and where we're headed. So as always, if you have not subscribed to my channel, please do so. I would greatly appreciate it. And you guys that have subscribed, thank you so much for your support. And as always, happy people do not cause problems. Peace.
If everybody winning, who's losing? I'm trying to make it make sense. It's like it's so confusing. I see the pain in your eyes from all the lonely nights. I swear I know how I feel. It just don't feel right.